Welcome to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
Today we're tackling something that's really shaping Britain right now, immigration. The whole landscape, the policies, public feeling, it all seems very much in flux.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of noise, a lot of political rhetoric flying around.
Right. So our goal today is to cut through that a bit. We want to give you, our listener, a clear, insightful look at what's actually happening.
Yeah, exactly. And to do that, we're focusing on a recent piece from The Economist. It gives a really solid analysis of the current trends and, importantly, these policy shifts we're seeing.
Okay, great. So let's dive right in. The article kicks off by highlighting something pretty striking. This contrast in how major political figures have talked about immigration over just, 20 years?
Yeah, it's quite the contrast. It zooms in on Tony Blair back in 2004.
Right.
And Labour's current leader, Keir Starmer. The difference in tone is, stark.
So Blair in 2004 was emphasizing the, quote, huge contribution of migrants.
Exactly. And he was pretty dismissive of claims that immigration was out of control. Said that was just wrong.
Okay. Fast forward to now.
And you hear Keir Starmer. He's talking about Britain as a one-nation experiment in open borders.
Wow. Okay. And saying things like incalculable damage.
And promising to close the book on it all. It's a huge shift in language, especially coming from Labour.
It really is. Now, Starmer apparently says this isn't, politically driven. It's about principle.
Well, that's the claim. But the article notes, and most observers would probably agree, it's hard not to see the political context here.
Which leads us neatly into this apparent rise in anti-immigration feeling.
Yeah, the political ground has definitely shifted. The article points to Reform UK.
The party that's very strongly anti-immigration.
Extremely so. And they've been performing well, haven't they, in polls in recent local elections?
And taking votes from both the Conservatives and Labour, it seems.
Which likely plays into why both major parties are now taking a tougher line, as the article suggests.
And what about the public? Does the polling back this up?
It does seem to. There was an Ipsos poll mentioned from April. It showed immigration as the #2 issue nationally.
Just behind the economy.
Just behind the economy. But crucially, for conservative and reform supporters, it was the #1 issue.
Okay, so it's clearly a major public concern right now.
Undeniably, there's a significant level of anxiety there.
So with all that political and public pressure, let's look at the actual migration numbers. The article gives some context.
Yeah, which is important. Through most of the 2010s, net migration was, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 a year?
Roughly, yeah. Then, of course, COVID hit.
And everything just stopped, pretty much, migration included.
But after that pause,
we saw a big surge. The article cites a figure of 900,000 net migration in the year, up to June 2023. That's a big number.
A huge jump. And where were people coming from? Has that changed?
It has. The source notes a shift away from mainly European arrivals, which was the case in the 2010s. Now it's more people from farther afield.
Okay. Now, this is where the article pushes back a bit on some of the rhetoric, right? Particularly Starmer's open borders claim.
Exactly. The analysis argues that's, not really accurate.
How so?
Well, the key distinction is pre- and post-Brexit. Before Brexit, yes, there was open movement, but only with the EU.
Right.
Since 2021, Britain controls immigration from all countries. So the higher numbers recently, they weren't because the borders were uncontrolled.
They were results of specific government policies.
Precisely. The article lists some, setting modest salary levels for skilled workers, actively recruiting health and social care staff.
Ah, yes, the NHS and care sector needs.
And letting international students work here for a period after graduating, plus those specific schemes for Hong Kongers and Ukrainians.
So policy choices, not open borders.
That's the argument in the source, yes.
But things might be changing again on the numbers front.
It looks like it. The article anticipates a, quote, dramatic fall in the next set of official figures from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics.
Okay, a dramatic fall. Why? What's driving that expected drop?
Mainly, it seems, rule changes that already happened. The Conservatives raised the bar for work visas back in April last year.
Ah, okay, so that's starting to bite.
That's the expectation. Plus, fewer people are now arriving under the Hong Kong and Ukraine schemes compared to the initial rush.
I see. But even with this expected fall, the government wants to go further.
Seems so. The Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, is quoted wanting to lower the figure even more, talking about a properly managed and controlled system.
Right. Which brings us to the new plans the government is proposing. What are the main restrictions they're talking about?
Well, there are quite a few potential changes mentioned. stricter rules for work visas generally.
Okay.
And specifically, care workers might not be eligible anymore, which would be a huge change for that sector.
Wow, yeah. What else?
Businesses might face more hurdles sponsoring foreign workers. They might have to prove to this labor market evidence group that they're really trying to train British workers first.
Okay, more hoops for businesses to jump through.
Seems like it. Also, shorter post-study work visas for students, maybe 18 months down from 2 years.
And something about spouses.
Yes, a basic English language test potentially being required for spouses coming to join their partners in the UK.
Okay, quite a range of measures.
Yeah.
But there's one more, isn't there? Something about settlement and citizenship that sounded quite significant, but maybe less defined.
That's right, and potentially the biggest change. Currently, many migrants can apply for indefinite leave to remain, settlement, after 5 years here legally.
Mm-hmm.
The proposal floating around is to possibly double that wait time to 10 years.
10 years, wow.
Unless, and this is the slightly vague part, unless someone can demonstrate a sufficient contribution.
And we don't know exactly what that contribution would mean in practice yet?
Not yet, no. The details are still unclear. But it signals a potentially much longer path to permanent settlement for many.
It certainly sounds like these policies are built on some assumptions about immigration's impact. What does the article suggest those assumptions are?
It does point out some, let's say, negative underlying assumptions. Things like immigrants push down wages for native workers.
Okay, the wage argument.
That businesses are somehow hooked on foreign labor instead of training Brits. That student visas are being misused, the asylum system too.
Right, familiar arguments.
And also this underlying idea that immigration harms community cohesion.
But the article contrasts this with something else, doesn't it? Something often left out of the conversation.
It does. It makes a really important point about Britain's actual history of integrating immigrants.
Which has generally been seen as relatively successful.
Yes. The article notes Blair mentioned this back in 2004, and it suggests Britain might actually be better at integrating immigrants and their children now than it was then.
So, a strength that's being overlooked in the current debate.
That seems to be the implication. This positive track record just isn't really part of the narrative driving these new, stricter policies.
So, given this shift, what potential problems or dangers does the article foresee with this new approach?
It raises a couple of main concerns. First, there's a risk the policies might fail in their intended effect, but succeed in unintended ways.
How do you mean?
Well, the argument is that asylum seekers, for instance, who the government often wants to deter, might not even be aware of these detailed policy changes. They're often fleeing desperate situations.
Right, policy details might not be top of mind.
Exactly. But who will be aware? Highly skilled people. The article uses the example of, say, an American software engineer with a PhD.
Someone who has choices about where to go.
Precisely. They will research the rules, the waiting times for settlement, the visa conditions, and these stricter policies might just deter them, the very people many argue Britain needs to attract.
And the article mentions there's even some Home Office research backing that possibility up.
Apparently so, yes. A survey suggesting highly skilled people are sensitive to these kinds of rules.
Okay, so that's one danger. Deterring the wrong people, potentially. What's the other main risk?
The other is simply the inherent difficulty of predicting migration flows.
History tells us it's tricky, right?
Very tricky. The article reminds us of past surprises. The surge from Eastern Europe after 2004 wasn't fully predicted. The recent rise in work migration post-2020, the scale of the Ukrainian refugee arrivals.
All difficult to forecast accurately.
Exactly. Events happen, global situations change, and migration numbers can fluctuate dramatically in ways governments don't always foresee or control, even when they think they have the levers.
And the article makes a really crucial point here about control versus numbers.
Yes. It stresses that having more control over who comes in, which Britain arguably does have post-Brexit, doesn't automatically mean lower numbers.
Because policy choices or global events can still lead to high figures, even with controls in place.
Correct, as we've seen. The article also casts a slightly skeptical eye on how the government might react if numbers do rise unexpectedly again.
Suggesting we might hear justifications about unusual circumstances.
Or assurances that everything is under control, even if the figures suggest otherwise. The source implies the public might not find such claims entirely convincing.
Right. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. What are the main takeaways for our listeners from this deep dive?
I think there are a few key things. First, this really noticeable shift in the political conversation around immigration towards a much tougher stance.
Definitely.
Second, understanding that the recent high migration figures were largely driven by specific policies and events, not a simple lack of border control.
Yeah, that's a crucial distinction the article makes.
Third, these new government plans signal a clear intent to significantly tighten the rules further across various immigration routes.
And we need to be aware of the assumptions behind those plans.
Exactly, the often negative assumptions about immigrants' impacts. And finally, acknowledging the potential risks, the article points out, like deterring skilled workers and the sheer difficulty of predicting or controlling these flows long term.
And for you, listening, grasping these different facets, the politics, the numbers, the policies, the assumptions, the risks, it's really vital for understanding what's happening in Britain right now and where things might be going.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you to ponder.
Yeah.
Given how hard it's proven historically to finely tune migration numbers, and given these potential unintended consequences, what are the real long-term implications of focusing so intensely on just reducing that net migration figure? And as this plays out, who ultimately stands to benefit and who might lose out in British society? Something to think about.